Chapter 14. Remembering the Fallen. The week that followed the tragic death of Jackson Tobin was a bit awkward. Rachel avoided talking to James as much as she could, and when they did sit down for meals together, she rarely spoke. James didn't try and force the issue. He respected her space and thought that she would eventually come round. She just needed time to process the events. Chris was well on the way to making a full recovery. The wound that had been stitched up was definitely going to leave a scar, but that didn't bother Chris. Just another one to add to the collection. And besides, chicks dig scars, he would say. The mental scar left by Jack's demise, however, was going to take longer to repair. They'd all felt a great sense of loss for their fallen comrade, none more so than Rachel. She was of a similar age to Jack, and although she hadn't known him for as long as either Chris or James, it had really hit her hard. She struggled to understand why it had happened to someone so young and full of life. Not to mention why James had not done more to rescue him before the end came. Maybe James was right, and she just didn't understand. Nevertheless, wasn't he meant to be one of the most highly trained former special operators? So surely he could have done more. Her mind was just a confused mess of questions, anger and deep regret. Why did James not take that shot? Why could he not retrieve the body? How could a book, however old and valuable, be more important than somebody's life? It took her a couple of days to realise that she was not actually angry with James. At the end of the day, had it not been for his actions, both herself and Chris would also probably not be there. She owed him her life, and maybe that was what she was angry about, that James had been forced to make a choice that, had she not been there in the first place, he may not have needed to take. She had never been in a position where you just have to make a split-second decision of such importance, a godlike pronouncement as to who lives and who dies. This was the root cause of her anger, and she may have been the reason for Jack's death, and it vexed her greatly. James and Chris tried their best to convince her that what happened up there on the ramparts would have happened regardless of whether she had been there or not. To believe otherwise was just her fragile state of mind, trying to resolve the painful feeling of loss that realistically was unresolvable. They knew that she would end up going one of two ways: drawing a line under the tragedy and moving on, or tearing herself apart with grief. We need to keep her mind on other things. The state she's in now is no good. You know what can happen. We've both seen this in the field, and you know the end result is not good, Chris remarked to James from his outstretched position on the sofa, currently acting as his makeshift bed until the wound had healed enough to allow him to move around without the danger of tearing it open again. I know what you mean. It's going to be an uphill battle. In this sort of state, the mind plays tricks, and you begin to doubt yourself. You know she shouldn't have been there in the first place. She wasn't ready. Like I had a choice. She would have come even if you'd told her to stay. She's incredibly strong-willed and stubborn when she wants to be. Maybe she wasn't quite ready, but let's face it, there never is the perfect time for these things. There always has to be a first time for everything, and you've said it yourself many a time, that baptism by fire generally produces the best. Takes after someone else in that department, James replied, in a tone directed at his injured compatriot. She's certainly been baptised now. Maybe doing some more research would help. Hopefully it'll keep her mind occupied at least. Can't hurt. What else has been going on since my minor surgery? Any news from the Mount? Is anyone investigating? Huh, investigating would be an understatement. From what I've seen on the local news, this morning, there's a whole army of investigators crawling all over the place. Luckily, they're being hampered by the weather, so there's a chance it won't come to much. Better keep an eye on the situation. Nobody can afford for the police to start poking around. That would be a disaster at this stage. I know. If they had found anything, they've yet to mention it. Could be your sort of poker player running the show, keeping the cards very close to their chest, waiting for somebody to make a mistake. Have you spoken to Jack's father yet? No, you know I can't. He didn't know anything about what Jack was doing, or our activities. Apart from sending my condolences, there wouldn't be much more I could add. Plus, they haven't made a formal ID yet. If I sent my condolences, a lot of questions would be heading our way very quickly. I think the best course is to wait until the funeral, which I'm sure will not be long. Could also be a good opportunity to sound out if the police have any leads. We'll have to tread carefully if we go. A foot in the wrong place and they may end up breathing down our necks. We? Are you high? You must have taken too much codeine if you think you're going. There's no way you're going. You're not in a fit state for that. Talk about putting feet in the wrong places. If anybody noticed your wound, we'd be in an interrogation faster than you could say Usain Bolt. Well, let's see what happens. You never know. It may be weeks until the funeral. We'll see, but I'm not keen. On the morning of the funeral, James's uncle arrived at Martinstowe. He had a few matters of estate business to address, and also he possessed the only key to the special collections room at Martinstowe, where the rarest and most valuable of the books were kept. Like most of the males in James's family, he was tall and broad-shouldered. Even though he was now in his early 70s, he still cut an imposing figure, although those that really knew him would describe him as one of the gentlest and kindest of souls. Much of the time he liked to keep to himself. He was an avid fisherman and enjoyed the odd choice cigar. Leaving Rachel in the company of his uncle, James and Chris travelled down to the Mount for Jack's funeral. Rachel did not being left at Martinstowe and was angry about the decision that she was not to attend, but she did understand the reasons behind it. Not only was there a real possibility that Norwood or some of his men would be present at the funeral, but also the police had issued a plea for information regarding 2 men and a woman, last to be seen in the company of the late Jackson Torbin. James and Chris were both good at blending in, whereas the sight of 2 men and a girl might raise more suspicion and attract too much unwanted attention. A cold nip in the air accompanied the crisp November morning. The ground, hedgerows and trees were all covered softly in a diamond-like layer of glittering frost. The overcast skies seemed to intensify the sombre atmosphere of the crowd that had gathered at the quayside of the Mount, awaiting the arrival of Jack's coffin. The coffin was transported from the mainland on a longboat manned by 8 sturdy oarsmen. The oarsmen were dressed in black coats over white shirts and white trousers. All the men wore black cravats around their necks and straw boaters surrounded by a black grosgrain ribbon upon which the letters of the boat's name had been embroidered by hand. Ultima. She'd been named at least 100 years ago by one of the previous lords of St. Leven. The lord had taken a great interest in Greek mythology, and although had known full well that the name of Charon's ferry boat had never been revealed, he liked to think it would just be called the Last. The men strained at the oars as they rowed across the 300-metre stretch from the mainland. As the boat neared the quayside, the 8 oars rose slowly skyward as a mark of respect, before they were carefully stowed along the gunwales of the boat as she came to rest alongside the dockside. The oarsmen gently took up the coffin on their shoulders, before steadily making their way up towards the castle. In front of them 4 drummers played a slow beat. The family followed the coffin, and the rest of the crowd fell in behind them to complete the procession to the castle. Chris was amazed at the numbers of people, including many lords and ladies, that had turned out to pay their final respects to Jack. He supposed it was only right. After all, Jack would have been the next in line to inherit the title of Lord St. Leven, an honour that would now pass to his younger brother, Piers, when he came of age. Still at school, Piers St. Aubyn would not officially be named as the heir presumptive until his 21st birthday. Jack's parents were clearly still in shock at the abrupt death of their eldest son. So far the police had been of little help. They had found little evidence in order to track down Jack's killers, or at least that was how it appeared on the surface. Their current public position was that Jack must have stumbled upon some burglars trying to break into the castle, and had died trying to protect his family home before he could raise the alarm. James wished that he could tell Jack's father what had happened, tell him how his son fought bravely to protect the freedom which we all enjoy. Tell him that he had fought with the same courage that his ancestors had done during the Crusades, that he had upheld the family's honour. Not that this would have helped to bring some sense of closure to the family. No parent is really prepared for the loss of a child. Unfortunately, James knew that he could not. He hoped that one day he would be able to. The procession paused outside the entrance to the chapel as the coffin followed the drummers inside. The drummers walked through the nave, bowing as they reached the transept under the tower of the church. Approaching the steps up to the chancel, they removed the drums and laid them to create an altar. This was in accordance with the drumhead service, a tradition for honouring the dead of the St. Aubyn family. The coffin was set down just behind this, underneath the tower. James and Chris looked up at the battlements with sadness, remembering the events of that fateful night, a night that they both wished could somehow be reversed, for the clock to rewind. Had they known then what the outcome would have been, the question that was nagging away at both of them was, would they have gone through with it? An answer that weighed especially heavily on James's mind, mainly because deep down inside he felt the answer would still have been yes. It was this painful realisation that he felt the greater good in preventing the Codex from falling into the wrong hands at any cost was a cost worth paying. Made his guilt all the more difficult to come to terms with. Not just because of the loss of Jack, but also because he had recognised that the logical conclusion to this thread was that he had already decided that he too was willing to pay the ultimate price. A sudden sharp dig in James's ribs from Chris broke his train of thought. "Isn't that the detective in charge of the investigation over there?" Chris said in a low voice, so as not to be overheard. "Where?" "That tall chap on the phone, standing near to the chapel entrance," Chris said with the subtlest of nods in the direction of the chapel entrance. "Does look very much like the photos I've seen in the papers. We'll have to tread carefully around him. I'd like to try and see if I can get some info, but not at the cost of piquing his interest." We just can't afford for a policeman to start poking around. Yeah, I know. Come on, let's go in before we do start attracting attention for loitering. Glenn had intended to pay attention to who was arriving to attend the funeral. Ever since the identity of the body had been confirmed and the revelation that it had been a close friend of Jack's that had given him the signet ring, Glenn had hoped that there was a chance they might attend the service. The way in which the ring had been crushed had sent him down the line of thought that maybe Jack's death had been the result of a friendship turning sour, and that a fight had broken out in which the result was Jack's death. It wasn't a perfect theory. It still did not explain the gun battle at the Mount, but it was the best that he could come up with at that moment. However, an untimely phone call had distracted him, so he did not notice James and Chris pass him by on their way into the chapel. Hi, D.I. Harris speaking. Good morning, Detective. It's Leonard Petronella from the College of Arms. I hope I haven't caught you at a bad time. Well, I was about to attend Jackson Orban's funeral. Oh, I'd forgotten that was today. I can call some other time. It was really just a quick call to tell you about what we've discovered regarding the coat of arms and the motto that you passed on to us. This took Glenn slightly off guard, and he didn't answer right away. He was torn. On the one hand, he didn't want to miss the start of the funeral and be one of those people who had to sneak in at the back after it had started, and yet he had a burning desire to know what the pursuivant had discovered. He knew that if he asked him to call back later, the knowledge that there was a potential new lead in the case would bug him all the way through the service, so he made a quick decision on the spot. No, it's okay. I think I can talk now. We'll be a few more minutes before the service starts. What have you found since we last spoke? Well, where to begin? I must admit, it has been a bit of a roller coaster ride through some of our oldest records. And if my conclusions are correct, you may have stumbled upon something that, as far as we were aware, was only legend. Oh, really? How so? Well, the squirrel cracking the nut, along with the motto, most certainly points to an obscure line of a Jersey family called Pipon. Although their motto has always been written in French, Vérité et Espérance, it translates to the same thing, truth and hope. What can you tell me about the family? Well, the earliest record we have of them in Jersey is from the Assizes Roll of 1309, but they certainly originated from France, and much earlier than that. The name may be derived from the French word pimpeur, meaning trickster, although it has been suggested that it may also come from the name Pepin, which has links to the Frankish kings. Originally the crest was a demi-lion argent, holding a mullet oar between the paws. Sorry, a what now? Oh yes, sorry. In layman's terms, a blue half-lion holding a 5-pointed golden star. Although this was changed at some point to the squirrel Sergeant, cracking a nut. Sergeant just means sitting upright. As for the family themselves, they've been prominent throughout the centuries, and there is far too much to go into now. There is a distinct difference, however, between their crests and the one on the ring. The Maltese cross? Yes, however, it isn't just a Maltese cross. We had to blow the image up quite a bit to make sense of it. There are in fact two crosses, one overlaid inside the first. The outer is definitely a Maltese cross, but the second and more significant is the one inside it. It's a Carolingian cross. A Carolingian cross? What's that? It's the symbol of the Carolingian dynasty. They ruled large parts of Europe during the 8th and 9th century. The legend goes that one of the kings, known as Pepin the Short, created a royal order of knights to protect the dynasty just before he died in 768 AD. Sorry to interrupt, but you said Pepin? Wasn't that one of the possible links to the family's names? Origins? Yes, hence why I think it may still be something to do with that particular family, especially as there are strong historical links between the family and Malta. Anyway, as I was saying, the legend regarding the Order of Pepin goes on to talk about the Crusades and finding a very powerful holy relic. It was said that it enabled them and the Knights Templar, who they were said to be involved with, to rise to a position of great influence. But there's never been any evidence to support this. To be honest, until I saw this, I'd almost forgotten about it. It'd always just been seen as a myth, a bedtime story to tell children. If it is the case that they do exist and have become active again, then we are all in for some very troubling times indeed. Why do you say that? Well, if the Order exists, then so does the relic. And if the rumours about the relic are true, then we are most likely witnessing the repercussions of a power struggle. A power struggle? Yes, I can only tell you the bits that I know, and I don't know a great deal on the subject. But as far as I know, the Order of Pepin was always rumoured to be the protectors of the relic. But there were other parties that wanted to gain control of it. Hence why the Knights Templar were purged in 1307, as other parties tried to wrest control of the relic from them. That's about as much as I can tell you. Is there any way of finding out more? From what I recall, there was a young professor who had some bizarre theory about them and what had become of them, but I can't recall his name after all. This must have been the best part of, 40 years ago now. I seem to recall there was quite a fuss at the time. He was trying to present some findings at the Royal Historical Society, but the ridicule was so great that he was laughed out of the society, and was said to have become a recluse. I'm sorry I can't be of more help, but I can't for the life of me remember his name. He must be well into his 70s by now, if he's even still alive. Thank you, sir. You've been more than helpful. Not at all. I would just caution you against delving into this too much. If indeed this is what has happened, they are not the sort of organisation you can tackle head on. They are, after all, almost like fanatics, and we all know what atrocities religious fanatics are capable of. By now they will be well entrenched in the seats of power, with all the levers at their disposal to continue their work unchallenged. Thanks. I'll bear that in mind. I must go. I think the service is maybe about to start. Thank you again. Have you've given me a great deal to look into, Glenn said as he hung up. His head was now spinning with all the information that he had just taken in. Fanatics, Templar myths, and holy relics. This was like something out of a work of fiction and actual reality. He would need time to process this, and then the next question was where to start, a question he was still pondering as he quietly snuck into the back of the chapel, just as the service began. The family standards that hung from the walls of the chapel were all unfurled. Beautiful flower arrangements of white and yellow lilies, lilacs, ferns, Snowdrops, irises, and forget-me-nots were dotted around the aisles of the church. Many people laid wreaths at the front of the drum altar before taking their seats. James had brought a wreath of white lilies and red roses that he too laid at the altar before he took his seat next to Chris. A hush fell over the congregation as the priest stood to lead the service. He opened with a poem by Robert Burns, his voice ringing out clearly through the church as he spoke. An honest man here lies at rest, as ere God with his image blessed. The friend of man, the friend of truth, the friend of age, and guide of youth. Few hearts like his, with virtue warmed, few heads with knowledge so informed. If there is another world, he lives in bliss. If there is none, he made the best of this. Robert Burns, 1784. He paused briefly at the end of the reading before he invited the congregation to stand for the first hymn, There is a Green Hill Far Away. Everybody stood as the warm tones of the organ began to resonate through the building. Jack's cousin Louis St. Clair gave a very moving eulogy. He talked about the great fun he and Jack used to have as boys, reminiscing about some of the mischief they used to get up to, praising Jack for being a true friend, someone that he could always count on for support. Louis almost broke down at one point, as his emotions almost got the better of him. He had been very close to Jack, yet he managed to pull himself together to finish his speech. Jack's father also spoke briefly. He had always been a man of few words. It was obviously a very difficult time for him as he gave his final farewell to his eldest son, tears rolling down his cheeks as he did so. The last to speak at the lectern was Jack's younger brother Piers, who read a poem by Canon Henry Scott Holland. Piers was nervous when he spoke, but his voice was steady as he read the words from the order of service. Death is nothing at all. It does not count. I have only slipped away into the next room. Nothing has happened. Everything remains exactly as it was. I am I, and you are you. And the old life that we lived so fondly together is untouched, unchanged. Whatever we were to each other, that we are still. Call me by the old familiar name. Speak of me in the easy way which you always used. Put no difference in your tone. Wear no forced air of solemnity or sorrow. Laugh as we always laughed, at the little jokes that we enjoyed together. Play, smile, think of me, pray for me. Let my name be ever the household word that it always was. Let it be spoken without an effort, without the ghost of a shadow upon it. Life means all that it ever meant. It is the same as it ever was. There is absolute and unbroken continuity. What is this death but a negligible accident? Why should I be out of mind because I am out of sight? I am but waiting for you, for an interval, somewhere very near, just around the corner. All is well. Nothing is hurt. Nothing is lost. One brief moment, and all will be as it was before. How we shall laugh at the trouble of parting when we meet again. Canon Henry Scott Holland, 1910. He managed to master his emotions by remembering his eldest brother's familiar grin that he had always put on whenever the two of them met got together. He paused as he finished and slowly descended from the lectern. At the bottom of the chancel steps he turned and bowed in front of the altar before rejoining his family in the front aisle. The final hymn was "Guide Me, O Thou Great Redeemer" by William Williams. It had been a personal favourite of Jack's, and seemed fitting to end the service with. During the third verse, the coffin bearers took up the coffin once again, and accompanied by the family and the priest, they descended down into the darkness of the crypt to place Jack with his ancestors, finally to rest in peace. A bugler sounded the last post as the hymn finished. It was a very poignant moment. James and Chris both recalled the memories of all those men they had served with that had lost their lives. James wondered how many more of his friends would lose theirs before this conflict was resolved. He hoped that the price would not be too high. After the service had finished, they took the opportunity to talk to Louis. They wanted to find out whether he and Michael had uncovered anything further about the glove. Unfortunately, they had gained very little extra information about this elusive organisation. However, Louis had left London as soon as they'd received word of Jack's death. Michael was apparently pursuing a new lead, so he may well have now more information. Lord Norwood sat behind the large mahogany desk in his study. Although he had been in regular contact with Chamberlain over the week that followed, it vexed him that his head of security had not been able to track down Flack and the others. In the end, he had decided to cut his losses and had recalled his head of security. It was time to put the next stage of operations into action. No doubt he would cross paths with Flack again. The only difference would be that when they did meet, he would make sure it would be for the last time. Flicking through the papers on his desk, he jotted down a few notes onto the small pad. He was ironing out the last few details of the journey he planned to undertake. At least his other operatives had been successful in discovering where the next part of the codex was likely to be located.